started writing at UNF in the fall. She chose this topic to address the misconceptions and arguments directed towards international adoption. So, last but definitely not least, we have Snatched into Family, International Adoption.
What are your views on international adoption? Is it your insurance, whether local or international, to see this? How? Concerning international adoption, we find ourselves surrounded the internet, mostly positive towards it, or mostly negative. Do you know any international adopted people? What are they like? Do they match what society says about them? These questions don't typically pop up in casual conversation, and why would they? Most people either have clearly defined views and opinions, or they don't really think about it until asked, so they lead to the general consensus based on what people around them say. Now, where does this general consensus come from? In a world where increasingly secular, isolationist, and abortionist theology permeates general consensus, knowing the truth about international adoption can develop informed opinions and different aspects of individual worldview. Although it was in the system before ancient Rome, adoption underwent its largest changes to international adoption. Not from the extended family, the neighboring city, or the neighboring nation, but overseas, of different ethnicity, of different nationality. Taken through 5 phases, each phase brought international adoption to the fore as a strategic demographic decision. World War II's end exceeded the first phase. Most of European adoptions from Germany, Greece, and later Japan. Peacetime post-Korean War brought the second wave, mostly from South Korea. Central, South, and Latin America underwent a third wave, and the fall remaining communism ushered in fourth, mostly from Central and Eastern Europe. Fifth and most recently, China's one-child adoption policy spiked international adoption, mostly with Asian girls. Now, these children, often by war, abandonment, or both, play no part in the negative stereotypes surrounding international adoption. Rather, it is the perspective change in systemization and subsequent corruption of international adoption procedures as again foothold in society. Corruption climbed, chaos collided, charter stories flared, documentaries exposed, and international adoption fell into a dark trafficking business. Although the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989 and the Hague Conference in 1993 rose to reform and restore, negative stereotypes and stigmas remain. Now, please do not misunderstand. These stereotypes and stigmas, questions and concerns, most of legitimate value because most stem from legitimate concerns. Concerns about choosing international adoption instead of the foster system. Concerns about child trafficking, stereotypes about attachment, and stigmas about the impact transracial families have on society or the impact society has on them. Not all these find their answer in old news or established ideas trained into society, and not all have utilitarian or logical answers. However, for the most part, despite underlying negatives, most folks would agree that international adoption is a good thing, regardless of their presumptions or societal views. I've used the term international adoption a few times now, and although it seems self-explanatory, I will clarify that the definition from the Consular Bureau of Affairs, which uses the term intercountry instead of international in its definition. It says, intercountry adoption is the process by which you adopt a child from another country other than your own through permanent legal means, then bring that child to your country of residence to live with you permanently. This sums up the emotional, economic, logistical hurdles and hoops to give a serialized explanation. In this thesis, I will use international adoption and adoption interchangeably.
We use adoption in the biblical sense, wherein God adopts believers into his kingdom and makes them his children and his heirs. Although I would like to address adoption with the foster system as well, I would not be able to do either side justice and take it on both, so I've narrowed it to the aspect I had easiest access to. So why does it matter that there are supposedly these negative stereotypes and stigmas around international adoption? People adopt anyway, so why do an entire thesis on it? Besides, if all the stigmas are trained into society from old news anyway, what makes it current? These are all great questions. However, perhaps the questions ought to be, why hasn't this issue been addressed enough to dispel the stereotypes and stigmas? Why is international adoption still an anomaly? Parents and children involved with international adoption need support and understanding from those around them, but often find no such resource. Further, as stated previously, God adopts believers as his children and heirs. International adoption reflects this, obeying the directive to care for the fatherless. And yet, it receives prejudice and pushback of those unaware of its realities. From this perspective, one of ignoring a need and shirking a God-given institution, this issue takes on an urgency for awareness and rectification. So what is to be done? How is this problem to be fixed? Please do not mistake this for a presentation pushing for international adoption, since not everyone should make such a huge commitment. This is not my thesis purpose, not by a long shot. In this thesis, I will address why people choose to internationally adopt, and why its processes are monetarily expensive. We will examine the importance of ethnic identity, the effect of racism, and address the reality of trauma associated with international adoption. Interwoven with these topics, I will draw parallels to biblical concepts and how this decision of international adoption carries out one aspect of the directive to care for the fatherless. International adoption has several misconceptions which need to be addressed so that people can have a better understanding of this God-given institution. Let's start with the most common question. Why international adoption? There's a huge need for foster parents and local adoption. There's no point going all the way across an ocean for a child when there are children available right here in America. This is indeed a good question. Logical, reasonable, with a solid backing in the fact that there is an entire foster system full of American children, some in need of families. The answer, from the perspective of logic and reason, is that there is no answer. Instead of using logic and reason, the answer uses calling and conviction, in that motivation for international adoption relies solely on what the adoptive parents feel called to and a conviction for. In an interview with Mrs. Melissa Selko, a godly woman with a strong Christian faith and a mother of 4 children adopted from China, she sums up this argument perfectly. Of her and her husband's decision for international adoption, she says, "We see adoption as a gift from the Lord, just as much as biological children would be." This statement reflects the general consensus of other adoptive parents I have spoken with. There really isn't true measurable, quantifiable, statistical data determining better or worse when it comes to local versus international adoption. It's not really a choice or a question of one child being a better choice over the other. All children need a loving home. Whether they're from China or Jacksonville, God places who he wills in each role. International adoption can be a conundrum to those not called, which is why this question of why has so much traction. It's much more of an intimate choice than an ABC formula with an XYZ answer. Now for the next question. Why is international adoption so expensive? There have been stories and news articles about child trafficking and about money meant for official processes being funneled into this tragic business instead. Some argue that if international adoption is truly beneficial, the prices should be cheaper, the process is shorter, all to make it as available to as many as possible. There's actually a twofold answer to this. To address child trafficking news, in an article concerning child trafficking horrors related to international adoption, E.J. Graff ends her tirade against international adoption by acknowledging that Hague Conference reforms might be just the overhaul needed to end such corruption. Leslie Doty Hollingsworth expands on the Hague Conference referenced by Graff in her study concerning the protection of international adoptees' cultural and ethnic identity. NHG details the long paper trail required by the Hague Conference articles, a paper trail kept available to the adoptee should they want to know their biological lineage. Naturally, it takes quite a bit of work to organize such a trail, obtain all necessary documentation to meet both countries' conditions, and coordinate between two governments, the orphanage or foster arrangement of the child, and a waiting family. To address why it costs so much, in an interview with Mrs. Leslie Matheson, a social worker with Lifeline Children's Services, she acknowledges that international adoption is expensive, but asserts it should not be easy procedurally or financially. It is a child's life, a person, an image bearer of Christ, something to be taken seriously. In order to make it as legally secure as possible, a lot of steps have to be taken. However, it is not buying a person, since adoption does not objectify children. It is paying for another's services and assisting with the adoption process, for using resources and connections available to make the transition as smooth as possible. Similar to how a toll road works. You do not buy the entire road. You just gain access to the other side. Adoption processes, which must be paid for, enable access to the road of adoption. When looking at international adoption, there are quite a few parallels between the emotional and legal processes and what God does for believers. Adoption is a biblical concept. God adopts believers into his kingdom, making them his children and heirs. In his letter to Ephesus, Paul frames this biblical concept as something of an anomaly when he writes, "This mystery is that through the gospel, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, and sharers together of one body, and sharers together in the promise in Jesus Christ." Adoptees are not just charity cases, pets, or poor lost souls to be trained into mini-me's of the parents. They are real people, real family, as real as any biological child. Paul speaks to the Jews of the Gentiles, who are not biologically related to them, but can still share in God's grace, because Jesus' death and resurrection offer salvation to all people. Gentiles are just as much his children as Jews. Regardless of ethnicity, they are all God's real children. Okay, that's all well and good. International adoption and all the expenses and parallelisms, but what about how the child personally feels about it? To ask a more pointed question, what about handling racism when it's encountered? Or what about the importance of ethnic identity? International adoption yanks the child out of their original country. Doesn't this cause issues like Americanizing them? Doesn't it effectively rob them of an important part of themselves? Well, this path of balancing a child's ethnic identity and their new family and new culture is less of a 100-foot tightrope than a roadside curb. In addressing racism to the outside world, transracial adoption can definitely turn some heads and draw unwanted attention and comments. It is something that parents have to be prepared for and prepare their children for. David and Renee Sanford, owners and editors of a communications corporation that works with leading ministries, authors, and publishers, places the role of education and preparation for racism on the parents. As role models, parents must set an uncompromising standard towards bigoted attitudes, something that children can look up to and something those outside their family can learn from. In addressing ethnic identity, this is very much a mixed bag. I found the interviews with Mrs. Selko and Mrs. Matheson helpful in addressing this topic, since I'm an adoptee with very little personal connection to China. To summarize, it all depends on the child. Some children feel like they are missing out. Some children could care less and want to put it behind them. Mrs. Matheson suggests that when going to a country to pick up the child, bring back and take in whatever you can of the culture. These can be souvenirs, pictures, and recipes. In your home area, try to find racial mirrors, people of the same ethnicity as the child, such as teachers, doctors, or playmates. Then, gauge how far the child wants to explore from there. Personally, I've seen a tendency for children to identify more with who their parents are and who God is to them. As Mrs. Selko so helpfully put it, every child has to deal with identity whether they necessarily look like their family or not. All right, so racism was dealt with, ethnic identity was explained, but what about the other biggest topics, like trauma, reactive attachment disorder, or RAD for short, and all those other issues international adoptees have? Aren't they more prevalent? Don't they generally cause more issues in biological children? Trauma is a huge factor in developmental issues, and most adoptees suffer from some kind of PTSD regardless of how early they were adopted. Reactive attachment disorder is hard on the whole family. It is the inability of the child to connect emotionally with their parents and siblings, often resulting in several other disruptive tendencies. Although not solely confined to the internationally adopted, RAD is most commonly associated with the adopted community. In fact, Michelle Merritt, an associate professor at Arkansas State University, wrote an article on how surveys show adoptees suffer more mental illnesses, attempted suicides, suicidal ideations, eating disorders, and addictions than their non-adopted peers. Now first, I will not argue that adoptees do not suffer from these things. Second, I would like to inform you that this is the most recent source I have, written in 2022. Merritt provided no citations for the surveys she supposedly had, and this may seem like I've built a weak opposition only to tear it down. However, I searched extensively for credible-looking surveys that Merritt, an associate professor at a state university, could cite. I could not find one. Third and finally for this topic, I would ask you as listeners to consider the possibility that biological children can suffer from mental illnesses and suicidal mentalities and disorders and addictions, but perhaps are not as documented as those put under a spotlight. This raises concerns, though, relating to trauma, reactive attachment disorder, and other issues. As acknowledged previously, these are very real. However, I would also argue that healing, to an extent, is possible. Mrs. Selko and Mrs. Matheson again provide helpful insight into this topic. Most of the time, institutionalized children find it harder to adopt than those from a foster arrangement, as adoption unfortunately does come from a place of loss and trauma the child has gone through. However, it is completely false that all internationally adopted children suffer from RAD. A lot of the time, it can look like they do because they're adjusting to a completely new environment, new people, new culture, which is a rough transition, as it would be for anyone. It's in this adjustment period that RAD is overdiagnosed. Reactive attachment disorder is a serious condition, one that should only be diagnosed after the adjustment period has ended. However, healing after trauma, to an extent, is possible. God works miracles in every family. Adoption is no different. International adoption is a reflection of what God does for believers, a following His command for Christians to care for the fatherless, and an institution that forms families according to His plan. C. Thomas Davis, a pastor of 10 years and theology consultant, writes in his book Fields of the Fatherless to consider His promise in Psalm 68, 5-6. A father of the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in His holy habitation. God sets the solitary in families. He brings out those who are bound into property. International adoption definitely reflects this, taking in the fatherless, assisted by the regulations and paper trails of participating countries compliant to Hague Conference articles. Christians are called to care for the fatherless in James 1:27, which says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." I realize international adoption is not for everyone, nor should it be. However, making an effort to support those who have adopted internationally or associate with and try to learn from their experiences, no matter how small this may seem, can really go a long way. Now, we have come a long way. We began this journey with a variety of questions. Why choose international adoption? Why is it so expensive? What about ethnic identity and racism? Then we looked at stereotypes surrounding mental illness and examined the reality of reactive attachment disorder. Throughout this thesis, I've also tied adoption back to its biblical parallels and how God adopts believers, making them his children and heirs, and explained how adoption carries out the command to be a father to the fatherless. Nearing the end of the speech, remember back to the beginning, if you will. There were a few questions I asked. What are your views on adoption? More specifically, international adoption. Maybe this thesis made you truly consider what it is for the first time. Maybe this thesis merely rehashed what you already knew. Maybe this thesis presented new information and answered those internal wonderings. Regardless of how you now answer this question, my hope is that when this topic next presents itself, you have a more defined, more personal, less generic view of international adoption. So now the question is, what do we do with this more defined, more personal, less generic view of an international adoption? My thesis is not meant to put international adoption on an idealized pedestal. It was intended to highlight a glaring need for support within the internationally adoptive community. In any area of your social sphere, church, work, school, etc., there may be opportunities to help, and you just weren't aware. Intentionality is key here. Actively ask for ways to help. Follow through with offering assistance. Be persistent. Help can be as simple as a meal for a family who just arrived back with their newest addition, or babysitting for a little while. Maybe a short visit to the family to make sure they know they have people that can go to for help. Don't let there be an awkward silence after the question, why hasn't this issue been addressed enough to dispel stereotypes and stigmas? Don't let silent awkwardness result after the question, why is international adoption still an anomaly? Work to make these questions obsolete. Share what you know. Don't conform to a general consensus. Support families who've been called to this life-changing decision, and those children who've been snatched into family through international adoption. Thank you.